We live in a world where our freedoms are being compromised, and people don't know exactly how they're being compromised, but there were individuals who did know how their freedoms were being compromised, and they were called abolitionists. In case you don't know what abolitionism is and abolitionists, well, check out my other video about that, but this video is what the abolitionists were targeting, and that was slavery. Slavery is the antithesis of freedom. So if we understand what slavery is and we define what slavery is, we can create and manifest the freedom that many people all throughout many different centuries desire. Slavery is that thing that the abolitionists had to abolish. That's what they were trying to get rid of, and they had to do so through education and moral suasion, they called it. Voluntarism. If you don't know these ideas, again, check out the other video. But this one is going to be the grassroots fundamentals as to what is the knowledge that's required for the action of abolitionism. So watch this video first, and then I would recommend watching the abolitionism video so you understand the action that's required based on this underlying problem. Because slavery is a problem that has held humanity back for thousands of years. It's not something we should just say, oh, it's gone, oh, we shouldn't pay attention to it. Nobody's practicing it anymore. It is still existent, and it's existent in the mass society of people are allowing it and don't even realize that they are directly allowing it. So let me explain, what is slavery? If we break it down from etymology, slavery means severe toil, hard work, or drudgery, and that's sourced from around 1550s, or it's also known as the state of servitude, sourced from about 1570s. The word slave from etymology means person who is the chattel or property of another. This is sourced from about the late 1200s and from Old French esclave from medieval Latin sclavus means slave. The source is also of Italian schiavo or French esclave or Spanish esclavo, originally Slav, used in this secondary sense because of the many Slavs sold into slavery by conquering peoples. So these people who were known as Slavs, well, they were being conquered by people constantly and turned into slaves. So the word Slav just became the word slave. It's sort of just the word that was traditionally passed on. Now, the word slave is also happening to relate to the word robot, because if you look at the origins of Rabu, it actually means slave. So just a little side note, maybe something to just keep in mind. There's a lot of people who say, man, I feel like a slave doing my job all the time, doing the same thing over and over again, and they feel like a robot. There might be other forms of slavery that we have to pay attention to. We're going to be talking about the most important one in this video. So what if we look at the word Slav, as I mentioned before? It is one of the people who inhabit most of Eastern Europe. So you saw a lot of slavery beginning in this part of the world. You can basically trace its origins back to ancient Mesopotamia. Okay, so you're looking at Sumer and Sumeria. If you don't know what that place is, you can look it up. It's considered the foundation to all forms of slavery and all forms of governments. So you have to question what was really going on at that time, symbolic for what I have to mention later on in this video. Now, the word slaveholder is somebody who is one who owns a slave or slaves. That's sourced from about 1776. The word slave driver is an overseer of slaves at their work. That's sourced from around 1807. Of course, there were other terms that were created, like the slave patrol that came later on, which is also happening to be one of the foundational stones to modern day policing. And a lot of the sheriff badges that are used in this today modern age is actually similar to the badges they had during the slave patrol. A lot of people don't really know that, but you can look this up as well for yourself to assure these facts. Now, the abolitionist Henry Clark Wright from the 1800s states that slavery is the submission or subjection to control by the will of another being. The former slave Frederick Douglass states, to be a slaveholder is to be a propagandist from necessity, for slavery can only live by keeping down the undergrowth morality that nature supplies. Okay, so he's basically, this is again a former slave and abolitionist, saying that morality is actually what helps a slave become free in their own mind and therefore free in their own body. Martin Luther King Jr. said similar things to this, saying how as long as the mind is never free, the body will never be free. And that mental slavery is the most dangerous. We're going to talk about that because this is the root to slavery. Now, the 20th century abolitionist Leo Tolstoy, so he came later on after the 1800s, he said, "This necessity to do what other people wish against your own will is slavery, and therefore as long as any violence designed to compel some people to do the will of others exists, there will be slavery." Leo Tolstoy was very outspoken about this. He made many texts about this, and he's known as one of the greatest writers of all time. So something we should definitely pay attention to and something we should definitely not ignore, saying that slavery still exists and that we have to pay attention to it and everybody's supporting it. He said the very same things that I'm saying right now. Now, there's a professor, Kevin Bales. He states that slavery is theft. Theft of the life, theft of work, theft of any property or produce, theft even of the children a slave might have born. So if it's just theft, what does that mean? How symbolic is that? If I steal someone's life, if I steal their ability to live their life as they choose, it may be all forms of wrongdoing if you deduce them are forms of theft. And if I'm claiming that I can dictate someone's fate, their future, and I say they're my property, I'm essentially saying they're my slave. So very tricky here, getting very specific. Author Wayne Dyer says, freedom means you are unobstructed in living your life as you choose, and that anything less is a form of slavery. So that opens the door to a whole wide view of many definitions of saying, here's a form of slavery, here's a form of slavery, and here's a form of slavery. But if you get to general premises, it's control by another person, control of your own life by another individual. So what is mental slavery? Because I mentioned this is the root, and you saw a little bit of it from the quotes I mentioned before. Well, mental slavery is commonly considered the most dangerous form. Mental slavery has been detailed by a number of philosophers, authors, researchers, psychologists, and historical figures as self-enslavement. Now, when I say psychologist, you can actually affirm this by looking up the Stanley Milgram experiments and the Stanford prison experiments. Of course, there's other experiments. These are some of the most banned experiments in the world, highly controversial because of their findings that people mentally will actually allow evil, everyday people, and they will actually not know how to control the situation, and it's all because of this underlying mental belief system, which we're going to identify here. This is also why many of the original abolitionists encouraged moral education or voluntarism as the only solution for primarily the slave who must free their own self, but also everyone. Okay, so we might say, okay, well, we got to change the people in power because we feel like we're being enslaved by this tyranny that is taking control over our lives. But maybe the focus is less on the people in power, but the people who are giving them power, the people who are compliant to the orders of the few who give the rules to the many who are obeying those rules. Maybe there's a servitude, a belief system in the masses that's keeping them in their servitude. This is what we're talking about. Martin Luther King Jr. stated, quote, "As long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free. Psychological freedom and a firm sense of self-esteem is the most powerful weapon against the long night of physical slavery." Frederick Douglass again states, quote, "To make a contented slave, you must make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision, and as far as possible to annihilate his power of reason. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. The man that takes his earnings must be able to convince him that he has a perfect right to do so. It must not depend upon mere force. The slave must know no higher law than his master's will. The whole relationship must not only demonstrate to his mind its necessity, but its absolute rightfulness." And you can question and say, well, taxation. We are convinced that some people's earnings should be taken for the benefit of another. But does anybody have the right to take anybody's money, period, for any excuse whatsoever? Unless it was your money and that's your ownership and you're taking that back. But no, this is money being taken from people, and they probably don't want that money being taken from them. I didn't consent to my money being taken from me, did you? So is violence necessarily justified against me because I don't want to pay, something that you say I should pay with my own money? I mean, this is my own money. This is ownership, right? So these are the questions even Frederick Douglass was challenging at the fundamental root basis of taxation. Bob Marley stated, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds." Mahatma Gandhi said, quote, "To end slavery, you must overcome the mental and physical inertia of the masses and quicken their intelligence and creative faculty." Mortimer Adler states, quote, "True freedom is impossible without a mind made free by discipline." Perhaps you rule yourself when you obtain the rules for yourself. Maybe you don't need a ruler in that case because you are your own ruler. Manly Palmer Hall states, quote, "It is demonstrated that to capture a man it is not sufficient to enslave his body. It is necessary to enlist his reason. That to free a man it is not enough to strike the shackles from his limbs. His mind must be liberated from bondage to his own ignorance." So, wrapping up all these concepts and bringing it together, what is the form of slavery that myself as a modern abolitionist am tackling? Why are we talking about slavery and how is it important to today? There is one form of slavery that lives at the root of all of it, and it's called political slavery. It's merely the realization that slavery results from man-made government and man-made law created by the belief system called statism. So this is the mental slavery involved in creating government, which is this political slavery. Statism is mental slavery toward the state. It is the belief that there is such a thing as authority vested in certain human beings, magically giving them the right to rule over other people, meaning that they, who we call government, have the moral right to issue commands to those whom they rule, those under their jurisdiction, and that their subjects or slaves have a moral obligation to obey the arbitrary dictates or laws set by their masters or slave holders. Most simply put, statism is the belief in the legitimacy of political slavery. Now, this might sound alarming to some individuals, and if that's the case, we have a quiz that you can take at theliberator.us/quiz. That's theliberator.us/quiz, and you can see for yourself, ask yourself these questions and reflect, am I upholding slavery and don't realize that I am, by simply evaluating my own morality. As modern abolitionists or voluntarists, and this includes some notable original abolitionists, they understood the problem with political slavery. It is merely the realization that the existence of government is illegitimate and immoral, and it is also realizing that the existence in government is that of which has allowed or ever maintained other forms of slavery to begin with. We have a quote from the 19th century abolitionist Salmon Chase, who states, quote, "Slavery is the complete and absolute subjection of one person to the control and disposal of another person by legalized force." He states, "We need not argue that no person can be rightfully compelled to submit to such control and disposal. All such subjugation must originate in force, and private force not being strong enough to accomplish the purpose, public force in the form of law must lend its aid. The government comes to the help of the individual slaveholder and punishes resistance to his will and compels submission. The government, therefore, in the case of every individual slave, is the real enslaver, depriving each person enslaved of all liberty and all property, and all that makes life dear. For slavery cannot subsist a moment after the support of the public force has been withdrawn." He's basically saying the power of the public can take slavery out of circulation, but they need to realize the root to this whole slavery situation is actually the government. Abolitionist Aidan Ballou, also from the 19th century, said, "Moral power is putting forth mighty energies to abolish slavery and elevate 4 millions of degraded beings to the rank of manhood. It is exerting its multiform influence to regenerate a corrupt public sentiment and to superinduce a will in the people of the United States to let the oppressed go free. Political power hinders and obstructs the progress of this reform by every means possible. It is wedded to slavery and will uphold it till a new public opinion compels it to stand off." William Lloyd Garrison states, quote, "The tremendous power of the government is actively wielded to crush out the little anti-slavery life that remains in individual hearts and to open new and boundless domains for the expansion of the slave system." Another quote from him is that we do not acknowledge allegiance to any human government. And this is somebody who's a very influential abolitionist, somebody who started the original Liberator newspaper in the 1800s, which I'm continuing as the Liberator too. Stephen A. Douglas states, quote, "Slavery cannot exist a day or an hour anywhere unless it is supported by local police regulations." Lawyer and abolitionist Lysander Spooner stated, quote, "The pretense that the abolition of slavery was either a motive or justification for the war is a fraud of the same character with that of maintaining the national honor." And he's another individual who lived at this time. Who but such usurpers, robbers, and murderers as they ever established slavery? Or what government, except one resting upon the sword, like the one we have now, was ever capable of maintaining slavery? And why did these men abolish slavery? Not from any love of liberty in general, not as an act of justice to the black man himself, but only as a war measure, and because they wanted his assistance and that of his friends in carrying on the war that they had undertaken for maintaining and intensifying that political, commercial, and industrial slavery to which they have subjected the great body of the people, both white and black. And yet these impostors now cry out that they have abolished the chattel slavery of the black man, although that was not the motive of the war, as if they thought they could thereby conceal, atone for, or justify that other slavery which they were fighting to perpetrate and to render more rigorous and inexorable than it ever was before. There was no difference of principle, but only of degree, between the slavery they boast they have abolished and the slavery they were fighting to preserve. For all restraints upon men's natural liberty, not necessary for the simple maintenance of justice, are of the nature of slavery and differ from each other only in degree. Another quote from him is that these tyrants, living solely on plunder and on the labor of their slaves, and applying all their energies to the seizure of still more plunder and the enslavement of still other defenseless persons, increasing too their numbers, perfecting their organizations, and multiplying their weapons of war, they extend their conquest until, in order to hold what they have already got, it becomes necessary for them to act systemically and cooperate with each other in holding their slaves in subjection. But all this they can do only by establishing what they call a government and making what they call laws. All the great governments of the world, those now existing as well as those that have passed away, have been of this character. They have been mere bands of robbers who have associated for purposes of plunder, conquest, and the enslavement of their fellow men. And their laws, as they have called them, have been only such agreements as they have found it necessary to enter into in order to maintain their organizations and act together in plundering and enslaving others, and in securing to each his agreed share of the spoils. All these laws have had no more real obligation than have the agreements which brigands, bandits, and pirates find it necessary to enter into with each other, for the more successful accomplishment of their crimes and the more peaceable division of their spoils. Thus, substantially, all the legislation of the world has had its origin in the desires of one class of persons to plunder and enslave others and hold them as property. The principle that the majority have a right to rule the minority practically resolves all government into a mere contest between two bodies of men, as to which of them shall be masters and which of them slaves. Another quote, a war carried on upon one side for chattel slavery and on the other for political slavery, upon neither for liberty, justice, or truth. And these crimes have been committed and thus war waged by men and the descendants of men who less than 100 years ago said that all men were equal. I mean, my goodness, these quotes are powerful. And you have another abolitionist, Brian J. Butts, who states, quote, just so long as the individual depends on the government or the church to settle the moral law, so long will slavery of every hue exist. Another 20th century abolitionist, Benjamin Tucker, states, quote, if the individual has a right to govern himself, all external government is tyranny. Hence the necessity of abolishing the state. And it even says in the paper that we call the U.S. Declaration of Independence that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Again, hence the word abolitionism. 20th century abolitionist Leo Tolstoy states, quote, slavery results from laws. Laws are made by governments, and therefore people can only be freed from slavery by the abolition of governments. Jonathan Swift states, quote, for in reason, all government without the consent of the governed is the very definition of slavery. Even psychologist Carl Jung stated that state slavery is a form of worship, and that the state has taken the place of God. 20th century abolitionist Mikhail Bakunin stated that if there is a state, there must be a domination of one class by another, and as a result, slavery. The state without slavery is unthinkable, and this is why we are the enemies of the state. So in case you need a lot more understanding about this worldview, because you might be completely new to this, and I would totally understand that, we at the Liberator 2, that this is this huge project that I'm creating to basically share all these ideas to the public, to, again, most people who have never even heard of this point of view, to further intend and prove our claim of political slavery as by admitting to our own ignorance through our own beliefs of statism. Right? And this is why we have testimonies of people sharing their own experiences, having to go through this belief system, having to battle their own mind and find out, wait, I was supporting a lie all this time. We interviewed people that were law enforcement over 40 years of their life, and they're like, man, why did I support this system? Why did I do this? And people in the health field are starting to realize this, people on the economics side of this, everyone is starting to wake up to the fact that they are destined to be free and that governments are not protecting rights, not protecting property, but actually always violating them. And they always have throughout history. That they're always going to rise and fall, and that the number one form of death is democide, which stands for death by government. And you can see, for example, World War II. That was not so long ago. Just as how it was not so long ago that we ended chattel slavery. That should give you hope, the fact that the abolitionists did something and moved us more toward freedom, but we have to finish the work that they have started, and that means getting rid of this political slavery that they speak of, and that's why all those quotes I shared were mostly from abolitionists. As themselves, them talking about political slavery and this belief of statism, and this is similarly documented in modern abolitionist books that have been written today. For example, The End of All Evil by Jeremy Locke. I highly recommend this book. It's very easy to read. Another fantastic book that goes into detail with every perspective is The Most Dangerous Superstition by Larkin Rose. I would highly recommend that. And then for more understanding slavery and abolitionism, I wrote a book called Slavery Gone for Good, so you can feel free to check out that if you'd like. It's also going to reference some other resources like the ones I mentioned before. So, thank you very much for watching. I do hope you get involved with this project and learn more as to, does slavery still occur and are we supporting it? Again, take that quiz if you haven't already and check out our abolitionism video that talks about the action necessary to end this dangerous belief system that we all have. It is a process, and it is not one that you can just vote in a new law or change the person in charge to suddenly end slavery. That's not what the abolitionists did, and that's certainly not what we have to do to attain real freedom. You can't just write it on a piece of paper. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. And as an extra resource, if you're interested, go to this page that I'm reading right now, the liberator.us/slavery, and there's a book going over all the myths about anarchy. It's debunking all the different myths, because people say, well, what about this and what about that? It's a short little book written very plainly, very easily, to the point, that helps you understand all these myths, breaking it down. In addition, we have 2 extra articles, one called What is Government and What is the State? I would recommend that to you if you want to know what is the nature of the beast of this system that we call government. Thank you very much for watching.